clinging to something that is temporary rather than trying to seek a permanent basis of happiness can really lead you down a dark path.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolsky.
And I'm Rudy Sallow.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a more knowledgeable life, a happy life. We're letting our critical thinking skills, our curiosity guide us to learn what we didn't know. And this episode is very cool because we are touching on a topic that we have not done before. Out of 100 plus episodes, 5 years, I can't believe we have never talked about Eastern philosophy before. And the bonus is that this is Eastern philosophy and Star Wars. Rudy, what did you think about this episode?
Look, I think this episode is right in line with everything that we do. We take something significant in pop culture, something that is pervasive through all of our lives, something that we literally cannot live without because it's everywhere. And that's the Star Wars franchise. But we take it seriously, right? We take a serious look at the Force and say, all right, come on, with this magical power, is there anything resembling that in real life? Is there anything resembling that in religion? Is there anything resembling that in philosophy? And we say, yes, there is. And our guest today has put out a phenomenal book, a very digestible book, a fantastically easily to read book on the philosophy of Star Wars. And she dissects the Force in a phenomenal way. And it really makes me appreciate the Star Wars franchise even more. Incredibly enough, she's made me even rethink the first 3 films, the prequel films, the ones that came before A New Hope, in a new light. And I now have a new hope for those 3 films and can't wait to rewatch them as a result of this episode. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really love about when we do episodes like this is that we find a scholar, an expert, and they give us a new window and how to appreciate the things that have been part of our lives. And Star Wars is definitely, part of our lives for millennials and Gen Zers. I mean, Star Wars was such a phenomenon that even Reagan would talk about the evil empire in his rhetoric about the former Soviet Union. Remember that, Rudy? Like, that's how big Star Wars is, and it continues to be huge in our life, like carried on to Gen Z, and even Gen Alpha is going to enjoy it.
We could not divorce ourselves from Star Wars. It's a cultural phenomenon. The whole world loves it. Now, if you ever had the thought like, oh, that's just a silly science fiction fantasy, please take another look at it after listening to this episode and after purchasing this book. I think you're going to really appreciate how beautiful the story is and how impactful it is.
And our guest is PhD, specializes in the Vedic tradition, Professor Dr. Krista Noble. We're so happy to be going over her book. I've never thought about Star Wars as a spiritual film, so I'm learning a lot, like reaching back to when I once studied Indian philosophy, like way back when. And her book is also a great guide to as a window or as an intro to Eastern thought and how we can learn more about Star Wars. Okay, now let's talk about the Force with Dr. Krista Noble. Well, let's dive in.
All right, let's dive
in. Krista, welcome to Good is in the Details. This is an exciting conversation we're about to have. Rudy and I both love Star Wars. Like I said, we're Gen Xers. We remember it when we were kids. And you crank out this book. I would love to know, what is your background in order to make this connection between Eastern philosophy or the wisdom of, let's say, Vedic texts and the Upanishads and Star Wars? What brought you to this connection?
Sure. I grew up in a family of meditators. Both my parents meditated, my sister meditated. So I learned to meditate when I was 10, and I found that really beneficial. But I also would discuss philosophy around the dinner table with my parents, and especially with my dad. He had a real passion for it. And I would study texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads with my dad when I was a kid. And I actually found it just fascinating and enriching. I ended up doing my undergraduate degree in history, but by the time I finished that, I realized that my real passion was for the Vedic knowledge and the Vedic teachings, and that's when I went on to study those in grad school.
Yeah. When you watched Star Wars then, did it immediately hint to you of the Eastern tradition, or was it something that you read? And I think something I appreciated at the beginning of your book is that you say that this was the intention behind the film. So we know we're not like imposing something on the film, but this is actually what the film's goal was to illustrate. But when did you see Star Wars and then make that connection?
I I saw Star Wars when I was a kid, saw the original trilogy, which my parents shared with me. The parallels were very clear. The Vedic tradition, that's ancient Indian tradition, as you know, or more broadly, Eastern philosophy, they really, really resonate with and have many parallels with the concepts that come up in Star Wars. So the ideas of the Force and using the Force, and even the fact that in some scenes we see the Jedi meditating, especially in the prequel trilogy, which came out later on. But the parallels were very clear at that point. As I wrote the book, obviously, I tried to go more deeply into every scene and to think of it from every new angle, but just based on the background I had, it was easy to see the parallels. And as you say, it was really neat to be able to delve into some of George Lucas's comments about Star Wars and his spiritual beliefs, and to see that that was very much his intention to draw on Eastern traditions and more broadly a very universal perspective on life as he was creating Star Wars. You know, he wasn't just intending to entertain, he was also trying to convey some deep truths to people.
And that's something that I think is so interesting. I mean, as somebody who teaches and I work in Western thought, I know a little bit about Indian philosophy, but I've never felt comfortable to try and teach that. You know, I would yield to somebody who has a much better expertise in that. And one of the things that struck me about your book is that here I am struggling how to explain something like, you know, universal truths and that you are one with the universe and consciousness and interconnectedness. And yet you lay it out in your book is so perfectly. And so something that seems to be difficult for people in Western thought to grasp, because we have this duality in Western thought, you know, the soul versus the body, and then maybe the soul carries on and goes to another place, and we talk about individualism and stuff like that. So it's hard to convey a totally different view of the universe. And yet, this is what I was thinking about when I was reading your book, when we all watch Star Wars, we get it. It's not complicated. Everything that you're writing, I'm like, oh, of course. Yes, this is how it works. It is not that complicated. But if you just sit down in a classroom and look at these two, let's say, different views of the world, it feels very hard for Westerners to grasp this idea of, let's say, quote unquote, the Force. Or maybe that's my experience. I don't know.
No, I think that makes complete sense. And thank you so much. You know, certainly there are parallels with Western traditions. Obviously, like if you have a more abstract notion of God just being kind of omnipresent, all-pervading, that kind of thing. The Eastern traditions do lay out these principles very systematically, and George Lucas was exposed to them, and I think that helped him come up with such a simple concept of the Force. You know, he thought of the Force as the essence of all religions, and so it's a very simple concept in one sense, as you say. Yeah, do you think your audience, are they already familiar with the analogy of the blind man and the elephant?
Oh, maybe, but let's do it, because
the answer is no, because I'm a member of the audience and I have no idea what you guys are talking about.
Yeah.
So assume no.
Perfect.
The way that I've thought about it, just before you get to that example, is the distinction between, let's say, the East and the West is that in Eastern thought, man is part of the world, whereas in Western thought, it's more of man is in charge of the world. And so those two different perspectives really impact even the way you interact in the world, as opposed to thinking that you are part of it, which is what Star Wars seems to convey and what the Vedic texts convey. But I'll yield. Let's do the elephant and the blind person. Is that what it is?
Close. The blind man and the elephant.
Okay.
No, it's actually a very simple analogy. It's a useful one. The analogy goes that a group of blind men want to know what an elephant is like, and so they go and they find one, and each of them touches a different part of it. And so one man touches its ear, and he says, "Oh, okay, so an elephant is like a fan. It's wide and flat." And another one touches its trunk, and it says, "Oh no, what are you talking about? An elephant, it's like a rope. It's long and it's narrow." And then another one touches its leg, and it says, "Oh no, it's like a tree trunk." Each of the blind men is correctly describing one part of the elephant, but they're incorrectly concluding that their description encapsulates the whole animal. And so this analogy has been applied to different religions, that they're like the blind men, that they're accurately perceiving certain aspects of life, but they're not perceiving the whole picture. And so I brought this up in part because George Lucas has brought up this analogy and says that he agrees with it, that different religions are just seeing different parts of the elephant. So it's this very universal perspective where he's coming at Star Wars trying to give people a glimpse of the whole elephant, not just one part, not just supporting one tradition or one religion.
I would love to know about this theme. Well, let's just start with, what is the Force? What is the Force, and what was his intention behind the original idea? What what was it that the Force is? Wait, what you said at the beginning of the book? Oh, shoot. The original line
Oh,
about the Force versus how it just came to be the Force.
so in the original drafts of the Star Wars screenplays, it was just called "The Force of Others," and he didn't really elaborate on what
Yeah.
they that meant. And there would be phrases like "May the force of others be with you," but it really wasn't part of the story. And then in later drafts, he made it play a much bigger part, and he elaborated a lot on that concept, and made it pretty central to the story.
And how is that? How is the idea of the Force paralleled with, let's say, themes from the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita?
So the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita refer to a universal level of consciousness, an abstract level of consciousness that's the basis of all individual consciousness. And they'll use the analogy of an ocean that waves on the surface, those are like individual minds, but at their basis, all the consciousness is united. There's a universal level, which is the ocean itself that expresses itself in the waves. That concept parallels very nicely this idea of the force. It's something that's all pervading, it's beyond the senses, it can be reached through meditation, through other practices, and even by tapping into it, when one can achieve more success in life, one can, in a sense, use the force or use this universal consciousness to achieve certain ends.
And we've mentioned meditation. You said you practice meditation, and then we definitely see that in Star Wars. You have in your book a bit of data to support the importance of meditation. So, what is it that meditation does for us to understand, let's say, how to live life well, how to navigate life? What are the benefits and what is really happening when we're meditating?
It's a great question. The
Thank
first
you.
thing to note is that different styles of meditation have completely different effects on the brain. And so meditation is kind of a catch-all term. So different styles do have significant benefits, but they're not really the same benefits. And so it's very interesting. There's been quite a bit of research on the brain waves produced by different kinds of meditations, as well as health benefits, psychological benefits, and so forth. So it's really interesting to look into some of that research and to get a sense of what a particular style, what effect that may have. For myself, I do transcendental meditation. That's been very broadly researched, many benefits across the board. So in terms of living a better life, I would say that style of meditation, it very naturally creates a deep level of peace inside that just kind of becomes the basis for action. On that basis, there's also more of an intuitive connection, an intuitive sense of how to act, partially because of that deep sense of peace and calm, but just an easier way of stepping into a challenging new situation and then having the sense from within, okay, this is the right way to go, not that way. Just speaking from my personal experience with transcendental meditation, but different styles of meditation do have significant benefits, and I really do encourage people to look into some of those because there's been quite a bit of research done on it.
Yeah, and I was thinking about it because it's such a theme in Star Wars where, Luke is going into himself and he's being taught by Yoda how to do this. In what ways in the films does it express what is supported and the benefits of meditation? Like, how is this a visual representation of what meditation can do?
I think it lines up well with the idea of using the Force. For instance, when Luke destroys the Death Star in A New Hope, he goes inside right before he does that. He closes his eyes, he turns off his computerized targeting device. There's this theme of going beyond the senses and not trying to act on that level. Sort of a similar thing when he's first practicing with a lightsaber and Obi-Wan says to act on instinct. Anyway, there's a connection here where meditation allows the person to go inward and then to act from a deeper level, to act from a more intuitive, more connected level, a level that's in harmony with the rest of the universe. And so by tapping into that level, even just for a moment, like Luke does in the climax of A New Hope, or ideally regularly, one can bring out that deeper level of reality. One can act in accordance with those evolutionary tendencies of the universe, and so can achieve success by destroying the Death Star or by achieving some other goal.
Yeah, just staying on the theme of meditation, for anybody out there that actually wants to try to tap into the force, if you will, I do think that there is something about practicing meditation and studying it and learning about it that is probably the closest that you're going to get to achieving something of what is portrayed as the force in Star Wars. It was so interesting reading your book and learning about the history, George Lucas's connection to the Eastern religions, even though he considered himself kind of a Methodist, and so he kind of married these two religions together author, and his goal, he specifically said that talking about the Force, that he wanted a concept of religion based on the premise that there is a God and there is a good and evil. And that's interesting. That's kind of like what the story was based off of. But taking something from Star Wars and applying it to your life, like, how can you do that? It's just a science fiction fantasy film. Well, meditation. While I was preparing for Good as in the Details, I was reviewing the Wall Street Journal yesterday. There was a really interesting short little opinion piece and review, and it was talking about this author. This author was going through a really tough time in their life, that this particular person was not a believer in religion, was not a believer in any mysticism, wasn't a believer in anything. It was basically just a doubter, but happened to stumble upon a meditation book when this individual was going through a very, 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 very difficult point in his life. And he read the book in a quick weekend, and he started to practice meditation, and it kind of like changed his life, and it changed his outlook, and it changed how he approached everything, and kind of opened his eyes and was able to live a better life. And what helped that individual get comfortable with meditation was the particular book that he stumbled upon had a lot of scientific basis for the power of meditation. This is not a bunch of, this is not like science fiction fantasy stuff, the power of meditation. There are neurological studies, there are neuroscientists, there is a lot of scientific background that supports the power of meditation. So what I'm trying to do is, I'm not trying to tell people, hey, you should meditate because it's cool and you'll like be like, like a Jedi. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you meditate, you will have powers that are like the Jedi because science proves it up. I've used meditation in my life, and I feel like I need to do a lot more of it. And whenever I practice it, I've just noticed that I am a lot more calm. I don't find myself falling into the three pillars that can turn a Jedi to the dark side. My anger subsides, my fear subsides, my doubt subsides, and my confidence rises up, and I have more control over, reactions. And it's just incredible that that there is this thing out there called meditation that can give you Jedi-like powers. And it's fantastic that I was reading your book and I saw this article, and just kind of comes to show you that sometimes life is trying to give you some signs that you need to do more of things. And I know I personally need to meditate more. Gwen, I'm curious, even though we're good friends and we host this podcast together, this is the first time you and I have ever talked about meditation. Do you meditate?
I have tried, Rudy. It is hard. I think, in some ways, I think you and I are similar. We've got racing brains. We've got our to-do list in the back of our head, and then we think about the things that we want to do, good ideas and creativity. And then it is very, very difficult to take that time. But I guess the closest I have it is when I go out on long walks. That's one of the reasons why I always advocate for walking. It's because it just gives me that opportunity to calm my mind.
There's a lot of studies out there, and perhaps Dr. Noble can back me up on this, that says, you need to do 30 minutes a day of meditation to get anything. You need to do 10 minutes a day to get something out of meditation. You need to do X amount. It actually turns out there's a lot of studies that say if you do 30 seconds or a minute consistently day after day, you will get a lot of the same benefits. And so where I do my meditation is after going to the gym and working out, I go into the sauna. Number one, I'm in the sauna. There's a bunch of dudes there. Some of them are naked. I want to close my eyes in any event, right?
Really?
So that's a perfect place to meditate, is to just like, all right, I'm in the sauna. I really don't want to be here. Let me get into myself. That's what I do. I don't know. Maybe that's helpful. So a sauna is a great place to meditate. Dr. Noble, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I just have to say that not all styles of meditation are hard. Some of them are actually quite easy. Though I will mention that is what George Lucas practiced. So there's something there. I will say about transcendental meditation, it does not require concentration or contemplation. It's a very simple, very natural technique. Just, I wouldn't want anybody to walk away and think, oh, I can't do meditation because it's too hard, because they're not all techniques are like that. They operate very differently.
Do you recommend doing it in the sauna and closing your eyes, like my suggestion, or you don't really, you don't want to comment on that? Yeah. Let's get back to Star Wars.
Okay. I have a question.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
I'm not going to be able to look at a sauna the same, Rudy. Thank you. A very big philosophical question, and especially in theology, is this question of what is good and what is evil. What does Star Wars bring out about the concept of good and evil that you see that's particularly Eastern?
Good question. I would say, first of all, that from a Vedic standpoint or from an ancient Indian standpoint, and more broadly from many Eastern philosophical standpoints, you can talk about that which is good as that which is evolutionary. From a Vedic perspective, the purpose of life is to reach your full potential as a human being and to reach higher states of consciousness. as part of that progression. So there's this evolutionary process that goes through everything that occurs in the universe, through every instance of reality. Within that construct, again, evolutionary action is that which promotes your evolution and also the evolution of those around you. And so you can think of it in terms of a river. It's like there's a river that's carrying you towards an ocean of truth and fulfillment. And that's the nature of life pulling you toward that ultimate goal. But you have free will, and so sitting in your canoe on the river, you can paddle with the current or you can paddle against it. And so paddling with the current is like evolutionary action. So that's action that's helpful to yourself, to others, that benefits them, that benefits you in a deeper sense, not in a selfish, narrow sense. Or you can paddle against the current, and that would be more enlivening the dark side of the force, or acting in a way that harms others, that ultimately does damage to yourself and your evolution.
One of the things that you put in here that has really stuck with me as a guide to knowing if you're doing the right thing or what kind of action you want to put out there is to look at yourself as your action is like a stone in the water causing ripples. Where are your ripples going to go? And I like that idea also because it does point to the idea of being connected. I mean, is there such a thing as just a purely individual act that has no ripple effect? Does that even exist? And if that doesn't exist, then that would make us far more aware of what kind of energy we want to put out into the world.
That's a great point, because from a Vedic perspective, from an Eastern perspective, everything is interconnected. Everything is deeply and profoundly interconnected. So every thought, word, and action ripples throughout the entire creation, just like you're saying. And so that does create incentive to be much more careful about the ripples that we're sending out.
And that's why I'm thinking this is, sometimes it's harder for, let's say, a contemporary Western mind because we are focused so much on the individual. This is different, saying like, hey, look, you are connected. Whatever you do is going to have some sort of a ripple effect. So be mindful of that. But there's also a great power in that. I don't think that's scary. I think that responsibility behind your actions, behind your thoughts is an exciting thing to think about the power of your actions.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt just a little tiny bit there and just do a little bit of a correction because somebody, here knows about this very, very well. And we've talked about this on our cognitive behavioral therapy episode. Actions, yes. Thoughts, no. Remember, our minds are assholes, and they sometimes like to put stuff into our brains and try to convince us that we have crazy thoughts. You do not need to listen to those thoughts. It's your actions that matter. Mm-hmm. I just want to make that correction out there because some people could be like, oh my God, I had this crazy thought and blah, blah, blah. That's going to affect the universe. No, it's your actions. It's your actions. Sorry.
Well, that's not actually the Vedic perspective on it, but I fully respect your perspective on it.
And I'm glad you brought that up. That's where I have issues. For somebody who had to go through cognitive behavioral therapy and apply it, I have to create the Rudiic philosophy in order to get through life and contribute positive things in the world. So I like to take things from little different places. I absolutely, completely disagree that a thought means anything whatsoever. So I'd love to hear the perspective on it. Please tell me.
Oh, a Vedic? So yes, going along with this idea of a universal consciousness, thoughts, that would be the ultimate source of thought. Thoughts would bubble up, if you will, from that source, coming from that source, but based on individual limitations, based on individual, even on a physical level, stresses and strains in the nervous system and so forth, those thoughts, which in their origin would not be negative, they could come out in a more negative fashion. Having said all that, to bring out a more positive aspect of all this, from a Vedic perspective, the deepest, most powerful thoughts are those that are evolutionary. And so just someone sitting there having negative thoughts is going to have a very minimal impact on the universe. Whereas someone who has expanded their mind, who has a connection to higher levels of consciousness, who has cultivated those levels of consciousness and is acting from that basis, is going to have a much broader impact on their surrounding environment. So, what you're saying is very much in alignment with the modern physicalist / materialist paradigm that, ultimately everything is physical, everything is material, and so how could something like a thought possibly affect anything else? But I'm just bringing up a countering perspective that
No,
from
I
a
actually I
Vedic
like it.
standpoint. Oh, okay, well, great.
You
Yeah,
want to know why? Because
sure.
you just proved that I am a Jedi. Let me explain. Because in my brain and in my upbringing or in my DNA or in my blah 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 whatever, there's just massive amounts of fear, and there could be massive amounts of, I happen to come from short-tempered people, and there's massive amounts of things that I've had to deal with for just upbringing and a whole bunch of other things that I'd rather not talk about, which proves that since I'm a pretty good guy, and I do a lot of really great things, and I do a lot of positive things, then I am stamping down the fear and the doubt and the anger like a Jedi does. I am more like a Luke Skywalker level Jedi rather than one of the lowly Jedis for all the crazy thoughts and things that come into my head. So actually, I agree with you. You're right. Thoughts matter. It's all about what you do with those thoughts.
I'm thinking about this moment of when Luke is confronted with Darth Vader and realizes that he's his father, or that Darth Vader is, and that he decides in the moment to not kill him. You write that is the moment that he became a Jedi. So I was wondering if we could just kind of tease it out. How is that moment indicative of Luke Skywalker actually accomplishing being a Jedi?
Sure. Just to make sure we're talking about the same thing, I think I said that about the moment in Return of the Jedi.
Okay.
Is that what you're referring to? I don't think I believe I was talking about when he first learns that Vader is his father. I
Empire
was
Strikes Back. That was that. Get your Star Wars right there, Glenn. Get your Star Wars right. It's malleable.
Okay.
No problem. But just the context matters in this sense because earlier in that movie, in Return of the Jedi, Luke had asked Yoda whether he was a Jedi yet. And Yoda said, no, first you have to confront Darth Vader. And so Luke goes and confronts Darth Vader again. He's feeling very tempted by the pull of the dark side, especially when Darth Vader threatens to turn his sister to the dark side. He becomes very angry and he flies into a rage and all. But at the climax of that scene, when Emperor Palpatine is encouraging Luke to kill his father, then Luke says to him, that'll never happen. I'll never turn to the dark side. I'm a Jedi like my father before me. And so both by that line of his, I'm paraphrasing, but both by that line of his expressing that he'll never turn to the dark side, that he is a Jedi, and by the continuation of his earlier conversation with Yoda, it seemed clear that Luke had gone and he'd faced the dark side, he'd faced the pull of it and everything that went along with that, and he'd come out on the other side and established himself as an agent of righteousness.
He faced his fear, right? He went back. He went to Darth Vader, much like me. Every single day when I wake up, you face your fear and you stamp it down, and you face your Darth Vader, and you too can become a Jedi. I have to ask Dr. Noble. This might be a little controversial, and I know you're in a difficult position because you have this book out there. But do you think that, there are the OG, New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, just brilliant films that you almost cannot recreate. And then in the late, 90s, 2000, there were the prequels. And then, in the last decade or so, there have been the new ones. Do you think that the core of the Eastern philosophical, beautiful juiciness of Star Wars is in those original 3 films as opposed to, the prequels and the latest films? I'm trying to kind of balance what I have heard. Okay. And here, I'm going to try to connect this. What I have heard that, a lot of people complained about the prequels, right? They're like, these are silly. These are ridiculous. Why were these made like this? And I had heard, I don't know this. I can't find the exact quote, so I apologize to Mr. Lucas, but I had heard that he had said, well, geez, guys, Star Wars was always made for kids. These were kids movies, and the prequels were like that too. And I'm kind of balancing that with these beautiful articles that you have. Beautiful lessons that you have from the books and all that hard work where that you've connected this with Eastern philosophy. And I'm starting to think like, no, these weren't really made for kids per se. This is really deep philosophical, religious thinking. Way of life. Maybe the prequels were kind of made for children, but the Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back and the Return of the Jedi, I think that there were messages coming out of that. If you don't feel comfortable answering this question, I'm just curious what you think. Do you think those first 3 films is where you will find the meat of the philosophy, or do you think it's spread out over the entire franchise?
I think it probably comes out most deeply in the original trilogy. Having said that, in all 9 of the Skywalker films, every one of them has some very deep principles in it. And even what you're saying about making it for children, I think some of the deepest principles are very simple. This idea of the Force, of some sort of universal level of consciousness, if you want to use that word, some sort of universal consciousness or intelligence or divine. Some of those ideas are very simple, but it doesn't make them less profound. But, the prequel trilogy, it has some really interesting points with regards to attachment, like the dangers of really intense attachment, like Anakin's attachment to his wife and how he's willing to just do anything and everything to save her, which takes him down a very dark path. And definitely in the sequel movies, there are some interesting parts that have some very nice philosophical parallels. Even just the thing where Rey and Kylo Ren are connected across very, very broad distances, mind-to-mind effects and collective consciousness. Those themes come out nicely in the sequel trilogy and especially in the final installment of that trilogy. I think probably a lot of the heart of Star Wars does come from that original trilogy, but I think there are deep philosophical ideas to be found in all of the films.
That was fantastic that you brought in the things from the prequels and things from the most recent ones. Do you think we're done with Star Wars? I mean, obviously the show lives on. I just recently watched the Obi-Wan miniseries, which I thought was fantastic, and I know they're pumping out these miniseries and everything. Let me ask you another difficult question. Are you still seeing these great philosophical, religious type lessons in these series like The Mandalorian, like the other ones that are coming out? Or do you think that those are really just in the movies?
Well, to be honest, in my book, I focused on the movies in large part because I knew that was what most people would have watched. I didn't want to keep my audience narrow to people who had watched a particular TV show. And in the aftermath of that, I have not had much chance to explore a lot of the TV series coming out. So I certainly don't want to say anything against them. I've heard some good things in favor of some of them, but I can't really comment until I've had more of a chance to delve into them.
Fair enough. No, that's fine. I mean, I will go ahead and rewatch a lot of them, I believe, in order to, as I've read your book, I think I now want to rewatch all of the Star Wars, in fact.
Same.
So you're encouraging me to go back and watch this beloved. We're so lucky to have had George Lucas produce this, not just for the entertainment value. I mean, your book really gives us a sense of there's a lot you can learn from Star Wars. And that's fantastic that you were able to put everything together. What I love about it is you don't just talk about Eastern philosophy. You talk about Christianity. You bring things in from the Bible. You bring things from the Old Testament, the New Testament. You bring things in from the Quran. This is not just focused on Eastern philosophy. You tie everything together very, very nicely, and I commend you on that.
Oh, thank you so much. For those who aren't familiar with my book, the first part of it does go deeply into the Eastern philosophy, but then using that as kind of a template, the second part of the book expands broadly and it brings up religious and philosophical traditions from throughout the world, just so your audience has some sense of how I approached the book.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Rudy, I'm like you. As I was reading the book, I'm like, I think I need to go back and rewatch this because I hadn't thought about these as spiritual films. And that's what's kind of intriguing me. There is one topic in here that, Rudy, is your favorite. We're going to talk about death. Rudy is terrified of death. I thought that the way in which, Krista, in your book, the way you're talking about how death is understood in the Star Wars films is also very much in accord with Eastern thought. I was wondering if you could expand on that. Like, what is the idea about death that is specific to Eastern thought that might be contrasted with a Western idea that comes through in the film?
Yeah. So, as you know, Yoda says that death is a natural part of life, and he says that twilight is upon me and soon night must fall. That is the way of things, the way of the Force. So the Jedi are not fearful of death. They have a sense that it's part of the natural universal process. And that does dovetail very nicely with many Eastern teachings, many Vedic teachings, which teach that death is not the ultimate end, for one thing, but I'll get into that in a minute, but also that it's just a very natural transition. And so, in the West, we tend to think of death in extremely negative terms, and I don't just mean in tragic situations, but even when someone has lived a long and fulfilling life and died peacefully, we tend to see that in very negative terms, and I think it all relates to our physicalist, materialist view that, well, of course, there's nothing beyond beyond death. So of course this is the end of everything good and it's just a horrible thing. But that's really not the perspective of the Jedi, as well as not the perspective of many religious philosophical traditions, including Eastern traditions. So yeah, certainly for the Jedi, they learn the secret to individual immortality. So even though on the one hand, they're not desperate to cling to life at all costs, that they consider it a natural part of life, unlike the Sith, who are willing to do anything to maintain life, even very horrible things. It's the Jedi who actually discover the secret to individual immortality. So there's this sense of life after death.
Once again, you've
Yes.
proven I am a Jedi, because I too am going to be immortal in a nice way. I'm going to transfer myself into a computer. So I am like a Jedi. So this is perfect. See, you're proving my point that you guys are recording with a real live Jedi. I don't fear death. It just ain't going to happen to me. So there. What do you think about that?
I mean, I find it very soothing. So I don't mean to, I don't want to poo-poo on my Catholic upbringing, but I do have to say that when I was in university and when I first learned about Buddhism and I studied it a little bit more, that I found the discussion about death to be far more soothing and comforting for me, as opposed to this idea that a person just, when they die, they go to another place and they're there and hanging out and waiting, and then you'll get to see them again. It's not quite as soothing. I explained it to one of my friends in this way, that when my father passed away, if somebody told me, your dad is in Maine and he's having a really great time there. It's beautiful in Maine, but you're never going to be able to talk to him or anything like that. But he's having a great time. So don't worry. Like, that's how I looked at the Catholic tradition or Christian tradition. And again, I don't want to poo-poo on it, but as somebody who is the survivor, it's very difficult. But then when I was learning about Eastern traditions and this idea that we are all connected, that there isn't an absence when somebody passes away. They're not gone or removed, but because we are connected, your existence is a carrying on of that. Like when I look in the mirror, I see the features of my entire family, right? And it gave me a lot of strength. And even when I look at my daughter, I see she's got, it almost made me tear up. She was playing baseball the other day. She's almost 5 and she's very thin and has glasses. And as I was watching her, I was struck by the memory of my father's friend telling me, your dad would go out there and play baseball, and we were wondering, who's that skinny kid out there with the glasses? And I was comforted. Like, I wasn't feeling an absence. I was comforted. And so that's something that I thought was interesting in that thought and that tradition. And that does come through in Star Wars.
No, that's a really beautiful point. I've heard the analogy used by a Vedic teacher of death being like there's water in a glass, and then it's just like the glass breaks. So just basically the water isn't localized anymore, but it's not like the water disappears or ceases to exist. So it lines up a little bit better with in Star Wars when they talk about merging with the Force. So it's just going back to that universal essence that is all things. And so there's never a separation from that. There's never anything that really ends.
Mm-hmm. And so, see, Rudy, that's why you can't put yourself in a computer, because that suggests that you're a localized thing that could be transported. Really, you're like the water that's going to go everywhere. There's going to be a part of Rudy everywhere.
Listen, this is my consciousness, and I will do whatever I want with my consciousness. So, there you go.
Could you explain the idea of attachment? Because I think also for Westerners, we like to get things, we like to hold on to things. So what is an idea about non-attachment and attachment that helps us navigate a good life, and that also comes through in Star Wars?
Good question. It's a subtle topic, but I would say, I think sometimes the word clinging is kind of helpful for Westerners, that I would say there's nothing wrong with having things, there's nothing wrong with enjoying them, there's nothing wrong with wanting them. I think when it becomes a problem is when there's so much of our identity, ourselves wrapped up in that thing, when it just takes on an undue importance to us. My life will be wonderful if I have that fancy car, and everything will be, that's when it gets into the really more materialistic aspect. I think that's when it can be a damaging thing, when there's this clinging and this need and this trying to fill a void inside with things that are temporary and will never bring permanent happiness. So from a Vedic perspective, the key to all this is to, through meditation and through other spiritual practices, to very naturally cultivate a level of inner peace and joy. And so on that basis, one can go out and enjoy everything in the world even more so, but one is also less attached to it, because if you just have this ocean of peace and joy inside, you're not just constantly looking in the outer world to find little bits of happiness here and there. So, you can enjoy your fancy car, but also at the end of the day, you're happy because of who you are, because of your consciousness. You're not happy just because you know what's in your garage. So with regards to the Jedi, I think they do a good job of showing in the prequel trilogy the harmful effects of being really excessively attached to something. In this case, Anakin being so attached to his wife Padme. Obviously, being attached to your loved ones to some degree is natural and healthy. But for him to take it to the degree of willing to do all sorts of horrific acts just to preserve her life against all odds, it can show how clinging to something that is temporary rather than trying to seek a permanent basis of happiness can really lead you down a dark path.
Yes.
I think you just literally saved the prequels for me. I mean, no, really. I mean, I really think just how you just put that all together like that is fantastic.
Thank you.
No, I mean, I really want to go rewatch everything all over again, and I will just try to, much like going into the sauna and closing my eyes. Whenever Jar Jar Binks is on the screen, I shall close my eyes and I shall meditate and I shall pretend that Jar Jar is not there, and that would be very Jedi-like.
It's a good approach.
Something else, Rudy, you and I think this is something we might both be interested in this question, is what is the difference between intuition and intellectualizing? That also comes up, to trust the intuition as opposed to the intellectual, but I don't want to let go of my reason. I don't know what the intuition is. How do you know when the intuition is right? How do you not just think through stuff? So what is the difference there? What should we be paying attention to? Your intuition versus your intellect?
I think that's a really important question, and I actually think it is good to be wary about that, because intuition can very easily be confused for superficial emotions, and I do not at all advocate for just following superficial emotions. Like, just because you want to do something does not mean that's at all a good idea. There's this distinction, in the Vedic tradition, intuition is a very, very deep level of the mind, whereas emotions are a very superficial level, and so they're two very different factors guiding us, and emotions can very well lead us in the wrong direction. And we even get a sense of this in the Star Wars films. We get a sense of following superficial emotions when Luke first confronts his father. Well, he doesn't know he's his father yet, but when he first confronts Darth Vader, he isn't ready yet to face him, and Yoda and Obi-Wan both warn Luke that he's not ready yet, but Luke is just caught up in the emotion of this vision he's had of Han and Leia being in danger, and so he ignores them, and he makes this very emotional decision, and he almost dies as a result of it. So that would be kind of a sense of where following emotions and or possibly even confusing them with intuition, that can be disastrous, or nearly so in this case. Whereas intuition, a better analogy from the movies, would be when Luke senses that there's still good in his father, even though everybody else has given up on him. He, in that sense, has a very deep intuitive understanding where, on an intellectual level, you'd say, well, look at all the horrible stuff he's done. Obviously, this guy is completely lost. We're never going to be able to save Darth Vader. But Luke, in that movie, has this very deep intuitive understanding that goes even beyond the intellect. And so I would just say, I personally, and from a Vedic standpoint, the intellect can be a very powerful tool. It's just that there can sometimes be even subtler truths that are beyond the intellect, and that's where intuition can come into play.
Just to be clear, Lizzie, from myself, tapping into, let's say, the Force, or let's say in the Vedic tradition, just this idea of oneness, that's not morally neutral. That is the good thing. So the bad thing would be to go against that universal consciousness, or like you said, going upstream, or going against I've already forgotten what our metaphor was.
Yeah.
But so it's not morally neutral.
No.
It's inherently good, the Force.
It's a good point you're bringing out, because George Lucas, he does talk about, the light and dark sides. And while that does have parallels in the Vedic tradition, the parallels aren't that this universal consciousness is in any sense bad. The simplest way to explain it would be that from a Vedic perspective, everything is the expression of consciousness, everything is the manifestation of consciousness, but some things are closer to its true nature than others. So it's kind of like flashlight. The degree of light diminishes the further you get from the source. So the same thing with universal consciousness, it expresses itself, but the further you get from the source, the less things really reflect those positive qualities that are at its core. And so it's the basis of everything that exists, but the closer you get to it, the more you become imbued with its essential qualities. And in the Vedic tradition, that's eternal bliss consciousness. So it's a very positive, very life-supporting thing. And that the more you're tapped into that, the more evolutionary your actions will naturally be, the more you will naturally and spontaneously paddle in accordance with the river rather than fighting it.
This idea of bliss and happiness and peace, what does that look like? How would we define that? So that, if somebody wants to say, oh, happiness is just an emotion, or it's so subjective, or it's pleasure, what is the idea of this bliss?
Right. So it's from a Vedic standpoint.
And really quick, is that nirvana?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add that it's not the band from Seattle. It is the actual Nirvana. Just sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, I love it when people make these connections. So nirvana is the Buddhist term for it. But yes, it's essentially referring to the same thing. From a Vedic standpoint, again, the terms they use are eternal bliss consciousness, but they consider that to be the fundamental nature of reality. So it's much more than a human emotion. So it's at the basis of all of reality. And it's said that the entire, everything that happens in the world is just the play and display of that consciousness, knowing itself, more fully experiencing its own nature, more fully and ultimately understanding its own blissful nature. Human emotions, happiness, surface level pleasure, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And then there are different levels of the mind, there are different levels of happiness. But the deepest happiness from a Vedic standpoint is that which comes from tapping into the source of all of reality. There's no joy in the relative world that can come close to that. So they'll use the analogy of the sun versus the light of a candle. Without tapping into that universal bliss consciousness, we can be very enamored of candles. Oh, they're so pretty. Oh, they're so light. But if you have a chance to glimpse the light of the sun, it's like, okay, the candle's pretty, but that's really what light is like, that brilliance. So again, it's from a Vedic standpoint, bliss in its deepest sense is much, much more than a human emotion. It's the most fundamental level of reality. And then as humans, to whatever degree we're tapped into that, we can experience varying levels of happiness.
Krista, thank you so much for your book. We want everyone to get it because I think what's great about your book, it's not just for Star Wars fans, but it's also a great introduction to Eastern thought. And I really appreciate how you broke down all the definitions, like what is Dharma, what is karma, what are all of these things. Thank you for coming on Good is in the Details and just bringing this delightful conversation. We love talking about film and we definitely love Star Wars.
Oh no, thank you both so much. I had a wonderful time.
Yeah, thank you very much. I learned a lot from your book.
Oh, fantastic.
I'm going to go back and rewatch and re-enjoy Star Wars. And my kids, they're 6 and 8, and they're asking me a lot of existential questions. This might help me answer some of them. So I really appreciate this. Your timing was excellent.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Glenn Lindowski and Rudy Sallow. Remember to check out our show notes and go to patreon.com/goodisinthedetails for all the extra content. The next person to sign up for our Patreon is going to get a gift from us. So remember, patreon.com/goodisinthedetails, and you can subscribe to one of the levels or follow for free. Either way, you're getting a gift from us. Check out our Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod. Take a screenshot of this episode or your favorite episode and tag us. Remember to hit that subscribe, that follow button, and if you're enjoying the pod, a 5-star rating. We'd also like to thank our sponsor for this episode, AvonmoreInc.com. It's that small business that started in the 90s and grew to an international sensation for bridge players. Go to AvonmoreInc.com and let them know Good is in the Details sent you. Okay, until next time, bye.